recognizes no religion and supports atheistic propaganda in order to implant a scientific, materialistic world outlook in people.
What do you think you're saying? I mean, that's an appalling thing to say. Of course it is.
Why is that an appalling thing to say? What do you disagree with in that statement?
Why would I want to support atheistic propaganda? I support science and truth.
But you don't support spreading atheism.
I support spreading science and truth. If that happens to be atheism, I support it. I'm not going to start bullying people into being atheist. I'm not going to start trying to compel people to be atheists. That was what the Albanians were doing. It's nothing to do with what...
Before we go any further, I just want to check something. Are you an atheist?
For all practical purposes, yes. Nobody can actually say for certain that anything doesn't exist. But I'm an atheist in the same way as I'm an a-leprechaunist and an a-fairyist and an a-pink unicornist.
So you're not 100% sure God doesn't exist, but you're sure enough to make it practically...
I'm as sure as you are sure that fairies and leprechauns don't exist.
And do you see an equivalence between the idea of God and the idea of a fairy and a leprechaun?
The evidence for both is equally poor.
You say in The God Delusion, one of my favorite sentences that jumps out of the page, that the God of the Old Testament is a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capricious, malevolent bully. As a piece of rhetoric, superb. But do you really believe that?
Congratulations on getting megalomaniacal right, by the way. Most people fumble on that. Yes, if you've actually read the Old Testament, I think you would have to agree. It's hideous. It's an the God of the Old Testament who is a monster.
But also the God of the Quran, the New Testament, the Hindu scripture?
Well, the God of the Quran, I don't know so much about. The God of the New Testament is widely advertised as being a bit more gentle. And certainly, on the whole, he is. There are things about the New Testament that I find, in a way, almost more objectionable than the Old Testament. But the sheer horror of the character, I said he was the most unpleasant character in all fiction, because I regard it as fiction, of course. And yes, he is. I mean, he's jealous, he's vindictive, he's callous, he's cruel.
And yet this is a God that is worshipped by, loved by, adored by, well, followed by millions, billions of people.
I hope not. I hope that the God that is adored by millions of people is a grown-up kind of God who is no longer... I hope that most people the kind of people I would like to know who worship and admire him, regard those stories as not literally true. Now, there are some who do regard them as literally true, and I suspect they either haven't read the Old Testament or they're not the kind of people I would wish to know, because you do not want to worship a character like that. By all means, worship some kind of great spirit of the universe, some kind of creative intelligence who created the universe, but don't worship this vile, vindictive monster of the Old Testament.
Why throw around these sweeping statements about religion? Not the God of the Old Testament, but religion itself being evil. I mean, do you believe religion is evil?
No.
But you say plenty of times in this book that religion is evil. You said in a speech famously that I think a case can be made that faith is one of the world's great evils, comparable to the smallpox virus, but harder to eradicate.
I do think that, yes. Because what I'm talking about there is faith, where faith means belief in something without evidence. Because if you believe something without evidence, then that justifies anything. You're no longer vulnerable to somebody coming back at you and saying, hang on a minute, let me argue the case. If you believe it without evidence, which is what faith is, then you don't argue the case. You say, no, I'm not arguing that case. This is my faith. It's mine. It's private. I don't dissent from it. I don't retreat from it. You're just going to have to accept it. Now, that is evil.
And yet you spend so much of your time debating people of faith. So clearly people of faith are interested in having discussions. They're not just all blind believers insisting on their way of...
Well, nobody said anything about all of them. I mean, the vast majority of religious people are perfectly good, nice people, as you are. There's no suggestion I've ever made that all religious people are evil. Of course not. There is a logical progression that goes from believing in faith, having faith that your God tells you to do something, and doing terrible deeds, like suicide bombing, like flying planes into skyscrapers. The vast majority of people of faith don't do such terrible things. But those people who do terrible things do it believing that they are righteous and good, and they think that they're doing the will of their God. So they're not evil people, they're actually good people by their own lights. They believe they're doing good things, and that's why religion is evil, because it can make you do evil things believing that they are good.
Do you really believe that people who go out and carry out suicide bombings, it is faith? Religion is to blame, not geopolitics, not the world, not their lives, not what's going on around us. It's religion, plain and simple.
Not always, it's not in the case of the Tamil Tigers, for example, but I think in a great majority of cases it is, and I think it certainly makes it a hell of a lot easier. The evidence is plain that in many Islamic suicide bombers, you talk to them, those who fail, you talk to them afterwards, they've got paradise on the brain. They're desperate to go to a martyr's heaven. And that's what they think about.
When we look at the Old Testament, Dawkins is correct that it portrays a violent and vindictive deity. In Deuteronomy 20:16-17, God commands the Israelites to wipe out entire nations. You shall not leave alive anything that breathes. In 1 Samuel 15:3, God tells Saul to kill men, women, children, and infants. These are not metaphors. They are written as divine orders. Historians like Hector Avalos and Bart Ehrman note these passages reflect ancient tribal conquest, not divine morality. If any human leader gave those commands today, we'd call it genocide. The same is true in Islam. The Quran promises paradise to martyrs, Surah 3:157-158, Surah 9:111, which has been directly cited by suicide bombers in their own writings. This isn't speculation. After the London bombings of 2005, investigators found martyrdom letters explicitly referring to Quranic verses. Religion provides the framework where killing innocents can be reframed as holy duty, and Dawkins' point about faith being dangerous lines up with psychology. Studies show that when beliefs are held without evidence and reinforced by group identity, they become immune to rational challenge. That's why otherwise decent people can justify violence, not because they are evil, but because their faith tells them it's good. History proves this, from the Crusades to modern jihadist movements.
Professor Robert Pape of the University of Chicago studied every known case of suicide terrorism, 315 cases, and he came to the conclusion that there's, quote, little connection between suicide terrorism and Islamic fundamentalism or any of the world's religions. The taproot of suicide terrorism, he says, is nationalism. It's about land, it's about power, it's about politics. It's not about faith. Faith is just a cover. What do you know that he doesn't know?
Well, I've seen other evidence. There are different people say different things. I've seen plenty of testimonies of suicide bombers who have said precisely that they do it because they want a martyr's paradise.
Do you include the 7/7 bombers in that case as well?
Yes, I believe so.
Have you watched their suicide videos?
I'm not sure that I have, no.
They talk about Afghanistan, they talk about Iraq, they talk about crusades, they talk about war between the West and the Muslim world, they talk about invading armies. I mean, there's a lot of real world stuff in there. I'm not saying, of course not, that faith doesn't play a role, but I'm just interested in this idea that you think faith is the issue. You said in a very famous column you wrote 4 days after 9/11 that this came from religion.
There are enormously good reasons for people to take political action, and this we see in Northern Ireland, we see it in Afghanistan, we see it in Sri Lanka where the Tamil Tigers operated. So yes, there are political reasons, but the promise of a martyr's heaven, which is, you cannot deny that this is part of Islamic doctrine. Martyrs go straight to paradise.
Yes, but not terrorists, not murderers, not criminals.
Well, they believe that because they're told it by their imams.
But then what about the majority of the world's Muslim clerics and ulama who came out and condemned 9/11 straight afterwards?
Well, I'm delighted they did, but they were pretty quiet about it.
What about the argument that says human beings are prone to violence, they're prone to carrying out crimes against their fellow man? You can blame religion, you can blame politics, you can blame economics, lots of factors, lots of excuses. What I don't get is, why do you only focus on religion? For fairness, why don't you also isolate the other factors?
There are lots of other factors, and I'm quite happy to say that, yes. There are lots of, I mean, if you look at the wars of history, some of them have been about religion, plenty of them have not been about religion. I never said religion is the sole cause of wars and violence.
You may not have said that, but you would accept that the new atheists, people like Sam Harris, the late Christopher Hitchens, have blamed a lot of history's wars on God and religion, and you make a similar suggestion in The God Delusion.
Yeah, I would blame a lot of history's wars, but the most terrible wars in history, the two major wars of the 20th century, are nothing to do with religion.
You accept that point?
Yeah, of course.
And the Cold War and Vietnam?
Yes, I would, of course, yes.
So when you have a situation where some of the world's worst crimes were carried out not by believers, how then does that square with your idea that it's religion that causes good people to do bad things, it's religion that's driving violence, your original statement against religion at the start of this?
Dogmatic belief in something like religion or something like Marxism or something like Nazism, these are all, or indeed patriotism, I mean, my country right or wrong, these are all pernicious beliefs which can drive people to do terrible things. And in the Second World War, Hitlerism was driven by racism, by a sort of sub-Wagnerian pagan religion which Hitler revived. Stalin's atrocities were motivated by a dogmatic belief in Marxism.
And atheism.
Stalin happened to be an atheist, but he was never motivated specifically.
The Soviet Union was not based on scientific rationalism, on the elimination of religion and God?
Stalin persecuted the church. Stalin persecuted just about everybody.
Are you saying that the Soviet Union, the leaders of the Soviet Union, were not driven by a hatred of religion and a belief that science and human progress and materialism was the way forward?
They believed that materialism, science, human progress, those are kind of there was a Marxist slant on those words, and they were hideously misused.
Mao Zedong, when he invaded Tibet, told the Dalai Lama that religion is poison. The subtext to the late Christopher Hitchens' book was religion poisons everything. Can you blame people of religion for saying, hold on, we've heard these ideas before, that religion poisons everything and it leads in one direction?
It's an incidental fact that Mao Zedong and Stalin happened to be atheists. They
incidental,
were not
it wasn't core to communism.
I think it was not core to communism, no.
So when Karl Marx was talking about religion being the opiate of the masses, that was just a throwaway line?
Yeah, I mean, that was an out of context statement. I mean, what on earth do you think that's got to do with atheism? I don't know.
Let me put a statement in context to you. Albania, one of the world's worst dictatorships, tyrannies that we've seen in the last 100 years. Article 37 of Albania's communist constitution declared, quote, "The state recognizes no religion and supports atheistic propaganda in order to implant a scientific, materialistic world outlook in people."
What do you think you're saying? I mean, that's an appalling thing to say. Of course it is.
Why is that an appalling thing to say? What do you disagree with in that statement?
Why would I want to support atheistic propaganda? I support science and truth.
But you don't support spreading atheism.
I support spreading science and truth. If that happens to be atheism, I support it. I'm not going to start bullying people into being atheist. I'm not going to start trying to compel people to be atheists. That was what the Albanians were doing. It's nothing to do with what I want to do.
Of course, but you'd like to persuade them not to be believers and become atheists.
I'd like to raise consciousness in a gentle, civilized way, using argument, rational argument, from
Robert Pape's study is often cited to say suicide terrorism is just about politics and land. But that's incomplete. While political grievances play a role, faith supercharges the act by promising eternal rewards. For example, the 9/11 hijackers left martyrdom letters quoting Quranic verses like Surah 9:111, which promises paradise for those who die fighting for God. Politics may light the fire, but religion pours gasoline on it by turning death into a gateway to eternal bliss. And when critics point to Stalin or Mao as proof that atheism is just as violent, they miss the distinction Dawkins makes. These dictators weren't acting on scientific rationalism. They were acting on dogmatic ideologies. Stalin didn't commit atrocities because he lacked belief in God. He did it because of an unquestioned political faith in Marxism. That's the same mechanism that religion uses, blind loyalty to an absolute authority. The Crusades, the Inquisition, ISIS, all justified mass violence not with politics alone, but with sacred texts that declared killing was righteous. And when regimes like Stalin's persecuted religion, they weren't advancing reason. They were simply replacing one dogma with another.
Evidence.
In your book, you cite lots of evidence for the bad things religion's done. What I wonder is, if you were being fair, wouldn't you have also included some of the good things that religion's done?
My passion is for scientific truth. I don't much care about what's good and evil, actually. I care about what's true. Do you actually believe in your Muslim faith? Do you believe that Muhammad split the moon in two? Do you believe that Muhammad flew to heaven on a winged horse, for example? I pay you the compliment of assuming that you don't.
No, I do. I believe in miracles.
You believe that?
Yes.
You believe that Muhammad went to heaven on a winged horse?
Yes, I believe in God. I believe in miracles. I believe in revelation. The point here is that let's assume I'm wrong, Richard. I'm wrong.
Let's
assume I'm wrong. I'm wrong. I'm happy to concede that, Richard. I'm happy to concede it. I'm wrong. All religions are wrong. God does not exist. We're all mad. The issue is we exist. We've existed for a while. I think even Christopher Hitchens said, and you've said in your writings, we're not going anywhere. So my question to you is, why not acknowledge, for example, the good things that religion has done? Do you accept that religion has done good things, despite all of our mad beliefs and our miracles?
I accept that individual religious people have done an enormous number of good things.
Not driven by religion?
Well, who knows?
You're very mean-spirited. You won't give any credit at all.
Take somebody like Martin Luther King, for example.
Reverend Martin Luther King.
Yes. Obviously, he was a cleric. I imagine that fed into the good things that he did. Plenty of other things did. He was a great admirer of Gandhi, and he was a great admirer of non-violence. He was a brilliant and wonderful, great man.
Would you disconnect MLK's non-violence and Gandhi's non-violence from their very strongly held religious beliefs? They didn't.
Well, I think it's not a thing that I really care about, actually. I think they were...
You do care about it, Richard. You're saying that people carry out violence in the name of God, and I cite to you an example of very famous people who have done good and non-violence in the name of God, and you say, I'm not interested.
If God doesn't exist, then doing something good in his name it's great that something good gets done, but there's no evidence at all that believing in God makes you more likely to do good things. I can't see any noble, logical connection between being religious and doing good things.
Let's concede that God does not exist. Let's concede that religion is false. My problem here is trying to understand why some of the new atheists are so anti-religion when religious people clearly are doing lots of good things and they're doing it in the name of God.
I've never denied that religious people are doing good things and non-religious people are doing good things. I care about what's true. I'm an educator, I'm a scientist, and I want people to understand the truth about the universe in which they live. That's what I care about. And I regard religion as a distraction, and in some cases a pernicious distraction from true education, which I love and value the way you value and love your God.
Can you not do both?
Well, so long as they don't contradict
each other.
Richard.
Richard.
As long as they don't contradict each other. But if you actually believe Muhammad flew to heaven on a winged horse, that's an anti-scientific belief.
And that could be wrong.
But that bloody well is wrong.
But that doesn't change. That doesn't change. How do you know it's wrong?
Oh, come on. You're a man of the 21st century.
No, I'm just asking. It comes back to my original question. The rational position is the agnostic. The rational position is the agnostic position.
Why up there?
The rational position. I didn't say up there. I didn't pick a place.
Okay,
you picked a place.
Why would a winged horse be the way to get to heaven if it's not up there?
I asked a question about. You asked about proof. I'm all for saying I can't prove it, but can you prove he didn't do it? This is the end-all debate.
He didn't fly to heaven on a winged horse?
I'm just asking on your criteria. I'm just asking on your criteria.
No, I can't prove it, and I can't prove it wasn't a golden unicorn.
But I'm fascinated that you're rather talk about what animals the Prophet may or may not have used 1400 years ago, rather than talk about what Muslims or Islam is doing in the world today, good or bad.
Well,
that seems to be the distraction. If anyone's distracted, it seems to be you.
Well, that's your view. I'm fascinated by how somebody, a respected, sophisticated journalist in the 21st century, can believe believe that a prophet flew to heaven on a winged horse.
Let me ask you this. Are all people who hold beliefs in God and in miracles and the supernatural, do you regard them all as intellectually inferior to you?
I regard those beliefs as intellectual nonsense. I don't regard the individuals as intellectually inferior to me, because many of them palpably are not. If you go back in history, then all bets are off, because before Darwin, for example, it is not at all surprising that before Darwin people believed in all kinds of things which they wouldn't believe in now. There are many people, many scientists today who say they're religious. And if you actually ask them what they believe, in many cases it turns out what they believe is in some sort of deistic God, some sort of intellectual spirit, some sort of creative intelligence that lay at the root of the universe, perhaps invented the laws of physics, something like that.
I don't agree with this book, but it's an excellent book, very well argued. You're very passionate, clearly. There's one section in the book where you talk about bringing up children.
Oh, yes.
And you talked about education. You talk about a story when you tell a story about being in Ireland and talking about the Catholic child abuse scandal. And there's one quote on page 356, which I will read out to you. Horrible as sexual abuse no doubt was, the damage was arguably less than the long-term psychological damage inflicted by bringing the child up Catholic in the first place. You believe that being brought up as a Catholic is worse than being abused by a priest?
There are shades of being abused by a priest, and I quoted the example of a woman in America who wrote to me saying that when she was 7 years old, she was sexually abused by a priest in his car, and at the same time, a friend of hers, who also 7, who was Protestant, or was of Protestant family, I should say, died. And she was told that because her friend was Protestant, she had gone to hell and would be roasting in hell forever. And she told me that of those 2 abuses, she got over the physical abuse. It was yucky, but she got over it. But the mental abuse of being told about hell, she took years to get over. And
with respect, Richard, you're an empiricist, you're a rationalist. One letter from one woman in America isn't really the basis to extrapolate and make such a sweeping conclusion.
That is, of course, true. And I'm not basing it on that. It seems to me that telling children such that they really, really believe that people who sin are going to go to hell and roast forever, that your skin grows again when it peels off with burning. It seems to me to be intuitively entirely reasonable that that is a worse form of child abuse, that will give more nightmares, that will give more genuine distress, because they really believe it. If they don't believe it, it's not a problem, of course.
You also say...
Let me just... I mean, I've been put on the spot about this health bar thing.
We haven't really been put on the spot. In what sense have you been put on the spot?
Well, I sense that you think it's somehow obvious that having a priest, if you're a small girl, having a priest put
I would be very interested in asking the audience whether being told about heaven and hell as a child, being brought up as Catholic, is worse than being abused by a priest.
Okay.
Let's have a show of hands. Okay. Is it worse to be abused by a priest? And if you believe it's worse for a priest to abuse a child than to bring up your child Catholic, raise your hands. Are they both as bad as each other? Raise your hands. So we have a 3-way split in the audience.
Dawkins isn't denying that religious people can do good. He's saying belief in supernatural claims, like Muhammad flying on a winged horse, doesn't make someone more moral. Martin Luther King, for example, was inspired by Christianity, but also by secular thinkers like Gandhi. Their message of justice didn't require belief in miracles. It required moral reasoning, which anyone can access regardless of faith. The bigger point is truth matters. And Dawkins sees religion as a distraction from truth. That's why he focuses less on whether religion feels good and more on whether it's true. Then there's his most controversial claim, that teaching children about hell can be worse than sexual abuse. He backs this with real examples in psychology. One woman told Dawkins she was molested as a child by a priest, but was more traumatized by being told her Protestant friend was burning in hell. That sounds extreme, but research supports it. Childhood religious trauma can cause anxiety, depression, and even PTSD symptoms well into adulthood. Clinical psychologists like Marlene Winnell call this religious trauma syndrome. Studies on adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, also show long-term fear and shame can damage mental health just as much as physical abuse. Dawkins isn't minimizing abuse. He's exposing how deep the psychological damage from fear-based indoctrination can run. Teaching kids to believe their loved ones are tortured forever isn't just wrong, it's abusive. And defending it because it's religion doesn't make it better. In short, good deeds don't prove religion is true, and false beliefs, especially ones rooted in fear, can do real harm. That's why Dawkins pushes back.
Defender of science. But what would you say to those people who say there are some quite important questions, genuine questions, that science cannot answer? Why are we here? What's the meaning of life? Where does morality come from? And that if religion wants to have a crack at answering those, what's science's objection?
I'm not sure I'd accept that science can't answer those particular questions. I think there are other questions science probably shouldn't try to answer, like what is right and what is wrong. Those are questions that are not the immediate concern of science. But what's the meaning of life? Why is there anything? How did it all start? Those seem to me to be scientific questions, or potentially scientific questions. If there are some questions of that sort that science can never answer, then we should at least keep trying to answer them. And if science can't answer them, religion having a crack at answering them, if there's no reason to think that religion has any basis for an answer, then why would religion have a crack? Why would you bother to listen to religion having a crack at answering them? I mean, one thing I would say is there may be questions that science can't answer, like the origin of everything. But if science can't answer them, then religion certainly can't, and nothing else can either.
Why? Why is it it's either science or nothing?
Well, yes, because science is the method of getting at what's true. I mean, if you take something like how did the universe begin, which is a very baffling, deep question. How did life begin? Another baffling, deep question. Both those questions are unanswered. The best methods we have of approaching those are the methods of science, because these are the methods that look at evidence, that evaluate evidence in all sorts of sophisticated ways. What has religion got to do with that, other than just looking at the writings of somebody who wrote a few centuries ago? I mean, why would you bother to read those writings?
So the great philosophers and theologians in history who have grappled with these big questions and thought about spiritual issues, moral issues, the transcendent, they're all wasting their time?
Yes, they're wasting their time.
What about, why does my life have meaning? What's its worth?
Well,
where does my dignity come from?
Your meaning and your dignity are up to you, and mine are up to me, and these are not questions that science would attempt to answer. Each person finds their own meaning in their own life. And good luck to them.
And what's wrong with religion offering moral certainties, if, as you say, science can't answer moral questions?
Science can't offer moral certainty, but I don't see that religion can either.
You don't think that the religious values we have today, the moral codes we live by today, were originally derived from Judeo-Christian values, Islamic values, Hindu values?
Not really, no. I mean, things like the Golden Rule, things like treat others as you would wish to be treated yourself. These are ancient values which crop up all over the world. They've been adopted by many religions. You can find justifications for them in moral philosophy. You can find justifications for them in evolutionary biology, which is my own subject. I don't seriously think you're going to base your morality on religion, because if you do, then you've got to say, well, do I base it on Scripture? I hope you don't base it on Scripture, because if you do, then you're going to have some pretty horrible values unless you deliberately cut out those parts of Scripture which are unacceptable to modern morality.
When asked about the big questions, why we're here, the meaning of life, or the origin of morality, Dawkins pushes back on the idea that only religion can answer them. He argues that questions like, how did the universe begin, or how did life start, are scientific questions. They may not be solved yet, but the best way to approach them is through evidence and reason, not by having a crack with ancient scriptures. If science can't answer a question, religion certainly can't, because it doesn't use methods that reliably uncover truth. On morality, Dawkins admits science doesn't hand us moral certainty, but he rejects the idea that morality comes from religion. He points to the golden rule: treat others as you'd want to be treated, which appears in cultures worldwide, independent of faith. Evolutionary biology also helps explain empathy and cooperation as survival traits. Religion may adopt these values, but it doesn't invent them. And here's where he makes a sharp point. If you really based morality on scripture, you'd have to accept the cruel and regressive parts of those texts too, unless you deliberately ignore them. That shows morality evolves with human reasoning, not because of divine command. For Dawkins, meaning and dignity don't come from religion or science. They come from each individual. Each of us must create our own purpose, and that's enough. So here's the big question for you. Do you think morality needs religion? Or can human reason and shared values guide us just as well, maybe even better? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like if this got you thinking, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into debates that shape how we see truth, morality, and meaning.
You might say, if you're a theist, that such acts are prohibited by God, and if there's no God, well, obviously they're permitted. Well, certainly it's true that if you're an atheist, you can't say they're prohibited by God.
Purge Christianity, shut down the churches, kill all the priests, establish the new man and the new utopia, liberated from the shackles of traditional religion and traditional morality.
Neither is a valid argument. So I want to focus on the particular question that we are discussing without getting distracted by issues about whether views that I hold are or not right. If Faith in Action or Christian Union want to come back and organise a debate some other time specifically about my views, I'll be happy to do that. That's not what we're doing tonight. What we are doing tonight is to discuss the issue that is often summed up in the contention famously put forward by Ivan Karamazov in Dostoevsky's The Karamazov Brothers, where he said, actually he didn't exactly say this, it isn't a quote, but it is a reasonable summary: if there is no God, everything is permitted. So I want to say, well, should we believe that? Why should we believe that? Why would anyone think, for example, consider any of the atrocities that we have sadly had to witness in this century, young as it still is? Think about 9/11, think about Darfur, or about the Congo, what's been happening there, or more recently, just very recently, fresh in our memories, what happened in Mumbai. And ask yourself, well, if there were no God, would all that be permitted? One question that might occur to you then is, well, what do you mean, permitted by whom? So, obviously, these actions, these atrocities, are not permitted by law in any nation, as far as I'm aware, these sorts of things. And even now internationally, we have a developing body of international law. We have an international criminal court which exists to make sure that even where these things, these crimes are not prosecuted in the country in which they're committed, that they are against international law and that people can be tried in the International Criminal Court, despite the best efforts of the professedly Christian administration of this country over the last 8 years to undermine the status of the International Criminal Court and to refuse to be part of it. So these things are not permitted by law, but of course we're not really talking about law, we're talking about morality. You might say, if you're a theist, that such acts are prohibited by God, and if there's no God, well, obviously they're permitted. Well, certainly it's true that if you're an atheist, you can't say they're prohibited by God. But first, the fact that theists can say that some acts are prohibited by God doesn't make it true that they are. And if there is no God, then it's obviously also not true that they're prohibited by God. That statement is false. So I'm just going to take 1 minute of my time, perhaps, to say why I think they can't be prohibited by God, because there isn't a God in the sense of a God in the Judeo-Christian tradition. There are other gods about which perhaps I might have other doubts, but the God of the Judeo-Christian tradition is supposed to be a God who is omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent, all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good. And if you look at the world around us, indeed, if you look at some of the very events that I've been describing, I don't think there could be such a God in this world, because such a God would not permit these events to take place. Now, if you might say, well, these events that I've described occur through human free will, and for some reason that's a greater good than the evils that humans commit, that still doesn't resolve the problem, because there's also immense suffering that occurs without any intervention of human free will. For example, people die not only because they're killed by other humans, but they die in droughts, and they die in floods, and they die in earthquakes. And often these people are innocent of any conceivable sin because perhaps they're a year old, and they die slow, lingering deaths. And it's hard to see how that can be justified or defended by free will. And even if, although I think this is a repellent doctrine, you were to say they suffer because they too have original sin, since they are descended from Adam and Eve, as indeed some Christians would say, we still have the insoluble problem of the suffering of non-human animals who are not descended from Adam and Eve, do not take part in original sin, and yet suffer slow, lingering deaths in droughts and famines and earthquakes, just as humans do. So I think there is no reconciliation of the existence of that kind of suffering and the kind of God of the Christian and Jewish traditions. So I think that it's not a good argument to say that these things are not permitted because God prohibits them, because you would need to defend the idea that such a God exists. So I think that the question, can there be morality without God, really comes to a question of, can there be morality given that we are in a universe without God? But of course, we can suspend our disbelief in God and ask questions about what difference would it make to morality if there were a God. So let's again then ask, why would one think that these acts that I mentioned, that I'm sure we all think and I think are morally wrong, would not be morally wrong if there were a God?
Peter Singer focuses on the central issue: whether morality depends on God. History shows that moral order existed long before organized religion. The Code of Hammurabi, Confucian ethics, and Greek philosophy all outlined justice, fairness, and restraint without divine command. Humanity has always built systems of right and wrong through cooperation and empathy, not revelation. Singer turns to the evidence around us. Infants die in floods. Animals starve in droughts. Entire regions suffer through famine and disease. These events are not the result of human will or moral failure. They are the outcomes of a natural world indifferent to suffering. Invoking original sin cannot explain why an infant or a fawn must endure pain. For centuries, philosophers such as Epicurus and David Hume have noted the same contradiction. A being described as all-powerful and all-good could not preside over a universe filled with innocent suffering. The problem lies not in human morality, but in the premise itself. Morality arises from human reason and compassion. It is created, tested, and refined by experience, not by divine command, but by human conscience.
In other words, why take the chance? But if I keep going, if I listen, you may say, to my Darwinian instinct, I feel this powerful sense of qualms and anxiety and frustration. There is, in a sense, the unavoidable sense that I'm doing something wrong. It is almost as if it's not just a feeling, it's not just a reason, it is almost as if, you may say, there is a transcendental voice that is speaking within me that has no power to coerce me, but has every power, in a sense, to establish an ineradicable standard that even I, try as I may, cannot resist paying attention to. My question is, where does this transcendental, powerful sense that is within us, where does that come from? What is its Darwinian foundation? The bottom line is I'm saying that whether or not we disagree on the margin about this morality or that morality, we all know that as human beings we are moral creatures. And by moral creatures, what I mean is we have moral standards. Standards that we did not create. Now, we may not live up to those standards. Peter Singer's right about that. But that proves absolutely nothing. It simply means the standards are better than us. Quite frankly, if we devised them, most likely we would not devise standards that we could not live up to. The fact is, we embrace standards, you may say, that set a bar that none of us can fully jump over or scale. Now, in some senses, this idea that we are Darwinian primates can generate an attempt to create, you might say, secular morality. One reason I'm interested in Professor Singer's work is he says very clearly, he says, many of the things that we take for granted, for example, take the idea that human life is sacred. He says that is not, if you will, morality, that's Christian morality. He says man is on a Darwinian continuum with the beasts. We're not special, we're no different. He goes, but what Christianity has done, and what man has done more generally, is take Homo sapiens and put him on this pedestal and assign to him special protections and special rights, which are at, you may say, while demeaning the rest of creation. Sort of the biblical idea that the rest of creation is now man's to use for his instrumental purposes. And what Singer says is that once we realize that God is dead, we've got to reverse all this. We cannot do what the new atheists want to do. The new atheists want to kill God, but keep Christian values of liberty, equality, compassion, and so on. And Singer can't do it. If you want to kill God, there goes human dignity. There goes the idea of the specialness of human beings. There goes the idea of human rights. Why he's working at an institute for human values, I have no idea. But nevertheless, now, the point I want to make is this. If we want to look at what secular morality really is, if we want to see if Dostoevsky is right, if God is not, everything is permitted, we cannot look to Belgium or France. We have to look really to the communist regimes of the 20th century, efforts to really, you might say, purge Christianity, shut down the churches, kill all the priests, establish the new man and the new utopia, liberated from the shackles of traditional religion and traditional morality. And when you look at the body count of those atheist regimes, by the way, a body count that would make a bin Laden blush, even a junior league atheist like Pol Pot in Indochina managed to kill about 2 million people in the short space of 3 years. So atheism, you might say, not religion, is responsible for the mass murders of history. Peter Singer, when he advocates infanticide, when he advocates euthanasia, and when in the same breath he advocates animal rights, he puzzles some people, but he is really, in a sense, thinking through the implications of atheism. He's saying if you remove God, man comes down from the pedestal and the natural continuum with the animals is restored. I know that because Singer has advocated the killing of infants and so on, the killing of the handicapped, some people have said he's a Nazi. And he has protested this and said, this is ridiculous, I'm not a Nazi. And I think in a way he's right. Because the Nazis advocated, you might say, state-sponsored genocide. What Peter Singer advocates is actually something very different. Private sector homicide. In other words, don't make the government do it, you do it. Now, I cite Singer's work not to prove atheism or God, but to show you that secularism, when you really remove the religious presuppositions, is a little bit of a frightening idea. We might be moving in that direction, but if we do, the next time you have someone over for dinner, just make sure to count your spoons. Thank you very much.
At this point, we're going to collect note cards and solicit questions that I hope you've been writing. If you're on the ground floor, please pass your note cards to the center aisle where they'll be collected. If you're in the balcony, please just pass your note cards to the back. And we'll take 1 or 2 minutes now to collect the note cards. We move on now to the rebuttals, starting with Peter Singer, who will have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Yes, we are Darwinian primates. We are, that is, primates who have evolved from other primates. I think that's established scientifically. Dinesh doesn't deny it, as I understand his position. Do we have to believe that there is some transcendental spark that is contrary to the evolutionary account in order to explain why we have morality and why we behave as we do, and why occasionally heroic people jump in and save heavy, drowning strangers, although also very often they don't? I don't think we do need any such account. I think we can explain the existence of compassion, concern for others, in the way we have evolved as mammals, as beings who've had to take care of their own children, as beings who've lived in small communities where we're often related to other members of the community and want to save them and support them, and that helps the survival of our genes as well. And of course, as social beings who live in communities that reciprocate, as indeed our close primate relatives do as well. We're not unique in this. And form reciprocal bonds. And there's a lot of research that suggests that the best strategy in these conditions is, at least initially, to help strangers. And only if it turns out that they are not going to help you do you then cease to help them or even pay them back for the bad deeds that they do you. The simple ethic known as tit for tat works quite well in game theory that models evolution. So it's possible to explain why we do some of the rescues we do in those ways. Some people perhaps have this to a stronger degree than others and therefore are more likely to do the rescues. What's completely compatible with the Darwinian account and is not explained by the idea of a transcendental light turning on that we need to save strangers because of our belief in the sanctity of human life, is precisely what I talked about before when I talked about our failure to follow the teachings of Jesus as reported in the Gospels about the rich people giving to the poor. We don't do that. We have 1 billion people living in extreme poverty in the world today, living on $1 or so a day. We have 27,000 children under 5 who died today, according to UNICEF, from avoidable poverty-related causes. That's 10 million a year, and we don't help them. Well, the Darwinian can explain why we don't help them. We've evolved these responses, this compassion, in a face-to-face society. And if we see a child there, a starving child right there, we will help. We'll take the bread off our table and give it to them, because that's how we've evolved. But if we learn through the papers that there are children in need of assistance, maybe not starving, maybe just needing better health care or safe water elsewhere in the world, most of us don't help. Christian or non-Christian, most of us don't help. And that's unfortunate, I think. I think it's contrary to the morality we should hold, but it's quite in accordance with what you would expect from a Darwinian account. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not possible for us to do more and help, and to act more morally than you might expect.
Peter Singer opens from a Darwinian premise. Humans are social primates whose moral sense emerges from evolution, not divine decree. Empathy, fairness, and cooperation are not gifts from heaven. They are products of natural selection. Frans de Waal's studies of chimpanzees show complex behaviors that mirror our ethics. Reconciliation after conflict, collective punishment of cheaters, even compassion toward the weak. Game theory experiments reveal why strategies rooted in reciprocity outperform pure self-interest. Neuroscience strengthens this picture. Moral judgment activates areas of the brain tied to empathy and future planning, not divine revelation. Conscience, in this light, is not a supernatural implant but an evolved instinct, a social mechanism that bound early communities together. Singer grounds his view in human reality. If morality truly came from a higher power, the world's suffering would look different. Every day, more than 25,000 children die from preventable poverty-related causes. Famine, exploitation, and inequality persist not because people lack faith, but because empathy evolved for small, visible circles, families, tribes, neighbors, not vast abstract populations. Understanding that limitation offers power. It means morality is flexible. We can expand it through reason, education, and collective design. Institutions, not commandments, can stretch compassion beyond the tribal level, just as democracy and human rights evolved through human effort, not divine intervention. Dinesh D'Souza responds from another angle. He speaks of an inner voice, a moral intuition that feels absolute, binding even when inconvenient. For him, that voice cannot be reduced to neurons or natural instincts. It points to a transcendental source, something outside of evolution, commanding allegiance regardless of consequence. He warns that when societies reject that foundation, they risk moral collapse. He points to the atheist regimes of the 20th century, Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, as examples of what happens when belief in a higher order disappears. In his view, the sanctity of life, human rights, and moral dignity all depend on something greater than humanity itself. The tension between Singer and D'Souza is philosophical but deeply practical. Singer insists that morality, like language, is an adaptive tool, something humanity built and can improve. D'Souza insists that without transcendence, moral laws lose authority. Yet history shows both sides shaping our current world. Secular reason gave rise to modern ethics, abolition, democracy, human rights, while religious traditions preserved shared symbols of moral duty and restraint. Both perspectives converge on one challenge. Survival depends on expanding empathy faster than our capacity for destruction. Whether that expansion is guided by reason or faith, the task remains the same: to build systems that protect life, dignity, and fairness. The question is not whose morality is purer, but which vision helps us act before indifference wins. Because in the end, the survival of morality may not depend on belief in God, but on how far humanity can extend its own.
The point I'm getting at here is, it is irrational to dismiss religion in so cavalier a way. At the very least, if most people are irrational, you've now got to give an account for why Peter Singer's eminently rational project can work with irrational human beings. Now, with regard to non-theistic morality, here's the point I'm getting at, and that is, I'm accusing in a way the atheist of profound ingratitude. I'm saying to the atheist what the greatest living philosopher, arguably, and an atheist, Jürgen Habermas said, that is that the core principles of our civilization, liberty, equality, human dignity, and the idea of justice, he says, are rooted in the Hebrew tradition of the prophets and the Christian tradition of Christ. Now, what he's saying is, even secular people ought to recognize this. It doesn't take a great deal of historical investigation to see that our civilization is built on Athens and Jerusalem. That is an historical fact. Our institutions and values come out of that. So the atheist is standing on a religious mountain that he or she ungratefully refuses to acknowledge. He's pretending, or she's pretending, I'm developing a purely secular ethic, although buried in that secular ethic are assumptions of compassion, of concern, of universal human brotherhood, of equality that have all been smuggled in and imported from Christianity.
For Peter Singer, if there is no creator to decide what is right, how are your views any more legitimate than anyone else's? Aren't yours just a set of preferences? What foundations do you ground human values on?
How are my views more legitimate than anyone else's? In one sense, the answer to that is simply they're not. That is, they have no authority. I'm not asking you to believe what I say because I'm a professor at Princeton or anything of the sort. On the other hand, I'm asking you to listen to what I'm saying and to the reasons why I'm saying it. And if my views are more legitimate than someone else's, it's because you think I've given better reasons for what I've said than that someone else, whoever that might be, would be. So that's your decision. That's, up to you and others who discuss the issue to see how the arguments come out. And that's what legitimacy in this area of philosophy consists in.
I'm going to go with the individual questions and then we'll end with the questions for both. I think we'll have time to get to all of them if our speakers continue in their short, pithy ways. Dinesh D'Souza, if the inner sense that you describe is the clue that God exists and therefore the guide to us to find morality, does what our inner sense say supersede the dictates of God? Could there be a conflict between these two moral guides, the inner sense and God?
Two things about that. First of all, I think that is a restatement of the conundrum raised by Plato that Peter Singer alluded to. First of all, let me say that I think that the reason I identify this inner sense as transcendental is that morality in general can be almost defined as that which militates against self-interest. If Darwinism can be understood as self-interest writ large, then morality can be understood as that which tells you to act against doing something that you otherwise would want to do. I want to steal. I want to have sex with every beautiful woman in the world. I want to spread my genes. Now true, there is a sense in which as a Machiavellian I might say I want to make sure I don't get caught. But short of that, that's my Darwinian goal. The voice that tells me not to do this is thwarting me at every stage. Every time I try to do something for my own benefit, it whispers no. So it is the fact that this inner sense operates against Darwinian self-interest that is a clue to its nature. Second point is the question of is it from God or is it not from God, and is justice identical with God? I think we're making here what philosophers sometimes call a category mistake, and I'll explain what I mean by reference to Plato himself. Plato's talking about justice, and he says, rather surprisingly, that the highest form of justice is discretion. Now, for us, that's surprising because we always learn that the best form of justice is law. But Plato says no. If you have, you might say, full information, if you are a philosopher king, if you are a god, then you will apply justice tailored to the individual situation. For example, if I have 3 children, I don't make laws. I look at their individual needs and I pattern my treatment of each one according to their own talents and needs. It is only in liberal society when you descend from the God's eye point of view to the human point of view, where we distrust human authority, that we say, look, we don't want to have discretion, we would rather live with law. In other words, when I'm speeding on the highway, I don't want to say, I'll let the cop kind of decide if I'm going too fast. There are some people who go safely at 70, there are other people who drive unsafely at 30. We're just going to let discretion be the order of the day. No, because we don't trust the cop. So we say, we'll all drive at 65 miles an hour or less, because liberalism is for human beings. Another way to put it is law is for fallible human beings. Law does not apply to God, because God is in that Platonic position of discretion. So the problem raised by Plato is a legitimate one as applied to all human beings. It is a meaningless one as applied to God.
Peter Singer, how do you explain humanity's ability to appreciate beauty, this hall, to love, to cry? Animals, non-human animals, do not have this.
Oh, I think that's clearly false in terms of love, for example. Obviously, beings with more sophisticated abilities can love in different ways, but it seems quite evident if you observe behavior of non-human animals, particularly, I'm thinking about mammals here, that there is love. One of the things that I object to about farming, for example, is that to produce the milk you drink, you have to repeatedly make cows pregnant and remove their calves so that you can get the milk. And clearly, every farmer who does that will tell you that the cow misses her calf and vice versa, that she looks around where the calf was. I've read anecdotes from farmers that months after the calf was taken from the cow, every time the cow passed that point, she looked around and bellowed for the calf. There is certainly mother-child love in animals. There is, I would say, there's clearly sexual love, sexual bonding in animals. So, you know, the human phenomenon is more complicated. It involves higher mental capacities, no doubt about it, but it is fundamentally the same capacity. And I think, you know, these other capacities that you asked about also have those kinds of accounts. Now, even in terms of beauty, there's an account in a book that I co-edited called The Great Ape Project by an observer of chimpanzees in Africa, how a chimpanzee would climb the ridge just before sunset and settle down on the ridge to watch the sun setting over Lake Tanganyika, clearly appreciating the spectacle, as indeed the human observer was. You know, this goes right back to Darwin's little book on the expression of the emotions in man and animals. What we have is continuous with the emotions that animals feel.
Mr. D'Souza, why do you seem to consider only the Christian God moral? What about other monotheistic faiths? And I might sneak in one because there's more for you. What do you think about Kant's argument that humans can have an understanding of goodness, perfection, and therefore a moral sense independent of God?
Well, first of all, that is not exactly Kant's position. Kant's position is that this morality derived from reason is nevertheless postulated on an assumption of God. But on other religions, I think that, look, all religions in the world are based on some idea of cosmic justice. Right away, you see a problem with purely secular morality. The problem with secular morality is that we live in a world where many times bad people prosper and good people come to grief. So any instruction we give people to be good must be sorely qualified by the recognition that many times it is the terrible guy who ends up on top, many times it's the good guy who comes to grief. Now, all the great religions of the world, in a sense, are based on the idea that while that may be the story of life, it's not the full story. That there's ultimately, you may say, cosmic accountability. So if you consider Hinduism, the idea may be that you're a perfect jerk in this life, so we're going to be seeing you as a cockroach in the next life. Cosmic justice. While the different religions of the world might differ in theology, they very often agree on morality. The theologian Hans Kung a couple of years ago assembled what he called the World Parliament of Religions. The Buddhists, the Taoists, the Muslims, the Hindus, all in the same room. And they sat down to say, what common things can we agree upon? And they drew up a charter.
Peter Singer makes a clear and grounded argument. Morality doesn't descend from faith. It emerges from human empathy, reason, and shared experience. We don't need divine command to recognize fairness or suffering. Evolutionary science shows that compassion existed long before religion. Primates reconcile after conflict. Elephants mourn their dead. Even rats refuse food if it harms another. These behaviors reveal that the moral instinct is older than any scripture, biological, not theological, rooted in survival through cooperation and care. Singer builds from that foundation. The moral values we uphold, equality, rights, justice, grew through reflection and struggle, not revelation. Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire, Paine, and Wollstonecraft expanded these ideas through reason and universal compassion. When slavery ended, when women gained rights, when cruelty to animals became unacceptable. These were victories of conscience guided by logic and empathy, not divine decree. Progress was driven by questioning authority, not obeying it. Dinesh D'Souza argues that morality implies God, that without a higher source, ethics lose meaning. But Singer points to evidence. Secular nations often rank higher in trust, generosity, and social welfare. Scandinavian countries, for instance, combine low religiosity with strong moral frameworks and civic responsibility. Morality thrives where people hold one another accountable, not where belief dictates behavior. Singer's view is straightforward but powerful. Ethics evolve through reasoned dialogue and emotional intelligence. Humanity built morality not as a command from above, but as a reflection of who we are. Thinking, feeling beings capable of empathy and justice. The real test of morality isn't whether it comes from God, but whether it grows with us, guided by compassion, knowledge, and the courage to do what's right without being told. What's your take on this? Do moral values depend on religion, or can empathy and reason stand on their own? It's a question that's shaped centuries of debate. Share your thoughts below. And if this sparked new ideas, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to keep the discussion going.